I'm not going to ask him.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're delighted to have so many people here gathered both in person and virtually to celebrate the launch of the wonderfully titled Tulpa Mea Culpa by Garry Thomas Morse. A fact you may applaud. It's always such a thrill to be able to engage with one of Garry's works in any possible way. So I'm so looking forward to not only hearing him read, and Garry is an exceptional reader, but also to hearing a little bit more about his process of writing this book. And we have a wonderful host here to do exactly that. And so I'll be telling you a little bit more about the person who will be politely interrogating Garry in just a few moments. Before I do, and before I get into the housekeeping notes about tonight, I'd like to invite up the publisher at Bay Press, the publishers behind this book, Matt Jodry, who would like to say a few words. So please join me in welcoming Matt.
Well, good evening, everybody. I don't usually do this, but I wanted to say a few words in regards to this book specifically, and what a book it is. I mean, it's yeah, maybe that's the best way of expressing it. I mean, it is Garry, and I'm just so thrilled that it's out. That is probably one of the most exciting things that we've done in a long time is putting this book out and working with Garry, which was an absolute thrill. I've been a personal fan of Garry's work for many, many years. I've read as almost everything that he's done, and yeah, it's a bit of a dream come true to actually put a book out by him as well. So I'm so thrilled for that. On top of that, I feel very fortunate that we've got Charlene tonight from Thin Air and many other things to be able to speak to Garry and pick away at his picadillos and see if we can't discover what makes him tick. Or at least get a little info about this giant, juicy, amazing novel that is hopefully going to end up in all of your hands tonight. So with that, I won't take up any more time. I'm just so excited and thrilled. And of course, no better place to do this at than McNally. So Garry, Charlene, go get him.
I'm sorry, Garry. You now have to settle for my housekeeping notes. Then I will excitedly introduce both of our participants. So just a few very quick things to bear in mind. The first is that there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions of Garry following the conversation. So if you are located here, please do feel free to just put up your hand. I'll run over to you Donahue style with this microphone, which is not a commentary on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those watching at home can hear the question. If you happen to be one of those people watching from home, I say staring deliberately into the camera, please just write your question into the chat and we will put them to Garry as time permits. Also, if you have any lovely comments for Garry, please feel free to write them in the chat as well. So Tulpa Mea Culpa has been described by Marina Endicott as incalculable, engaging, and exhilarating, which anybody familiar with Garry's work will certainly know is incredibly true. Garry has published several collections of poetry, notably Discovery Passages about the history of the Kwakwaka'wakw Indigenous ancestors, apologies for my clumsy settler tongue, shortlisted for the Governor General's Award, and Prairie Harbour, also shortlisted for a Governor General's Award, and a truly fantastic work of poetry. His novels have gained critical attention for pushing the aesthetic envelope. He is the author of a speculative fiction series called the Chaos Quincunx, and 2 of its 3 books have been nominated for the ReLit Award. Morse is the recipient of the 2008 City of Vancouver Mayor's Arts Award for Emerging Artists. He has also served as the 2018 Jack McClelland Writer-in-Residence at the University of Toronto and the 2019 Carol Shields Writer-in-Residence at the University of Winnipeg. I will now say a few things about your host, and then I will call up Garry to read. The only thing I will point out right now is that immediately following the event, I will have some exciting notes for you about signing procedure. But for right now, the only thing I will put in your brain is that we will have to get Garry to the signing table before we can move along with the signing. So we'll ask you all to remain in place for one moment before we summon you over to the table. And there'll be more at the end about that. Your host for this evening, my good friend Charlene Deal, is a writer, editor, performer, and former English language professor, which is a combination of words designed to trip me up, and the longtime director of the Winnipeg International Writers Festival. She has published poetry, essays, reviews, and a beautiful memoir called Out of Grief Singing, a memoir of motherhood and loss. She co-edited a jazz magazine for 12 years and is the producer of the Izzy Asper Jazz Performances. In 2019, she was honored with the Winnipeg Arts Council's Making a Difference Award for her contributions to the local arts community. You'll be hearing more from Charlene soon, but for now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Garry Thomas Morse.
Thank you to Charlene for being here. She's been a good friend of mine over the years. And thank you to Matt and Bay. And Matt actually worked really hard on this cover, which is beautiful. And it's they're like, I call them the spermatic paper dolls. I call them that, but they sort of communicate something about the book of these multiplying physical doubles and whatnot. So I don't want to know how he made them, but and thanks for everybody for coming out. So this book has 3 parts, and so they're different they're stories that all are interconnected. So the first part, there's a poet named Gellhorn who's doing this residency in a dynamic metropolis city, not this one. And so the main thing is he discovers he has a physical double who's an actor, in some bit part stuff. And so he's learning all about that person. And so that's, I'll talk a little bit about what he's discovering in here. So I'm going to read a little bit from those 3 sections each, and then maybe if there's time, a short little Easter egg. Not so illustrious a life, a number of trifling appearances, and in his favor, a few as a stunt double. It was only the 2 credits as writer that irked Gellhorn. Given his elusive quarry, he was fortunate to have access to an enormous university library half a block away. Within this ashen brown monolith, nicknamed the Death Star by Nadej and others, resided a media library with more than enough evidence that Aaron Schnell, that's his double, was making his mark on celluloid, if that term is not too old hat. Gellhorn was prepared. He had written out the names of each of the films along with their catalog numbers, a feat that impressed the young woman at the counter, who remarked that she would like to watch movies this way and really should, only to regret having voiced her thought later. He nodded grimly, having no wish to give himself away as the double of a stunt double, or even a double take cat. That my understanding is a double take cat is someone that looks incredulous twice in a shot. I heard that on a TV show. She returned with all of his requested films, except for one called Hopeful Calves, which had vanished into digital limbo. Gellhorn began with January Snafu, a romantic comedy about a man and woman whose medical records got mixed up, leading to endless hijinks, and as one unknown critic proclaimed, a diagnosis of sensual hypnosis. Even so, it was not easy for Gellhorn to catch sight of his double. His strategy was to try and isolate any actor his double could double for, which turned out to be a guy playing a clumsy nurse who looked similar from the back and in profile. This must have been a plum role for Aaron Schnell, given that the nurse was responsible for the snafu and central to the ongoing shenanigans. Did you see it? Well, remember the male nurse who was always tripping and landing on his ass? Yeah, that was me. Or this was the limit of Gellhorn's speculation concerning the doubles party chatter. A writer still had the luxury of being somewhat introverted, but an actor, especially a bit parter, would undoubtedly have to talk himself up at every opportunity. There's not much point going into the significance of the movie's title, but it is a nice touch. Never mind, this isn't Gone with the Wind, or so Gellhorn's mother would say when faced with too many credits, especially at the start of a film. There's the extent of his heredity, aside from his being a scarcely noticed birth, even by a slim carrier, until it was nearly time to make his unobtrusive entry into an unforgiving world. Incidentally, this mother would be quick to deny that she had skimmed a magazine retrospective about Hemingway's stoic companion without realizing she was about to give her son a celebrated woman's surname for his presumably anonymous endeavors. A rapid-fire burst of denials would greet the assertion that Gellhorn had ever had a twin brother, and certainly not one sold at market prices to give the quieter child a head start in life. Though there's no getting around the fact that Gellhorn and his double, Mr. Schnell, shared an L of linguistic tissue, hinting at a common point of origin. With an ounce of omniscience, we can uncover more than a syllable of resemblance between poet and actor. True, it might be easier to map out symmetrical echoes in the Bartók string quartet we'll encounter later, but you'll have to take my word for it. Gellhorn and his double were each capable of the same contortions and gesticulations, the same coilings and tremblings, the same palings and purplings. They could each achieve a tonal shift from enraged ogre to lugubrious gloomster to the ebullient idiot at the drop of a hat. Whether performing upon a slightly raised platform or rubbing elbows with their fellow groundlings, each reflection contained the scarcely perceptible shadow of the other. Sadly, we cannot derive so much from The Fatality of Fuzz, Serial Numbers, or the affirmation film Changing Light, in which the double, lacking faith in a cantankerous manner, fell out of a dormer window. His likeness, once he was permanently disabled, found he had ample time to reflect on those profound mysteries in life. In other words, there was a reason for everything. No more stunts followed, but the double was clearly visible in one of the pews at church, singing a hymn along with the others. Well, thought Gellhorn with an iota of pride, they must have liked his face to include him in a crowd scene like that. The Fatality of Fuzz, dealing with all the potential dangers of souping up police officers with genetic material extracted from peaches, required that the double bounce off the front fender of a speeding car. Serial Numbers made use of the double as one of the less fortunate hostages during a botched bank heist. The Rain Only Falls at Night was the first film to let the double appear as a non-double in the speaking role of a night manager at a dingy motel. He had 2 brief scenes before, spoiler, he was found with a knife in his back. He managed to gasp a muffled warning to the 2 lovers before the knife was pulled out, releasing him to his fate. Gellhorn watched these 3 scenes over and over again, the letting out of the room to the lovers, the titular mood-inducing conversation about the nightly rain, and the rasping of that mortal warning. Aside from the rictus grin that followed the motel manager into a night from which no wayfarer returned, the face and voice were without a doubt Gellhorn's. So I'm going to go on to the next section. Okay, so the middle section is called Chair, and it involves a chair who oversees some other chairs at a university. And it's kind of vague, but anyway, he's researching an author who's passed on, a departed author called Thomas Clack, who's written the first part of this book, or the section in there that's about Gellhorn. And so there's all these little stories as this chair goes through this autobiography. He's kind of putting together a biography surrounding all these fragments. And there's all kinds of different kinds of stories in the middle part. So this one, big preface there. This one is about a guy that he's not written a letter, but he's become fascinated or maybe obsessed with a city councilor. And he saw his picture on like a garbage can. And so he's beginning to think of the letter he would like to write to this person, because he has to tell him, this whole section adds up to kind of detective story or kind of a crime story. So he does have something to tell him, but it takes a while to get around to it. So I'll read a little of this from this guy who's thinking about writing a letter to him about, he feels very intimate with this person in the garbage can. He was not my councilman being on the boundary, but he was the councilman I would have chosen. I should clarify that he was not there in corporeal form. Through the light snowfall, I saw a banner that was attached to an elongated receptacle for garbage and recycling. There he was, Maurice Moritz, predestined to serve civic interests. The little problem that had been eating away at me would have been halved because 2 heads are better than 1, or so I told myself. In spite of his lopsided smile, I could tell at once that I was in the presence of a superior intelligence. Trust me, I always know. That dopey grin won me over, even if it made him look a bit shifty. You may not entrust your life savings to some guy with that smile, but that had no bearing on whether or not he could keep a confidence. Maybe I needed an official who had grown accustomed to murky dealings. Rest assured, petty larceny was nowhere in my thoughts. For the record, I'd like it to be noted that I stood under the falling snow for quite a spell before reaching a conclusion about Maury and me. I do not know for a fact that he prefers to be called Maury. Being a man of the people, surely he must get it whether he likes it or not. I will respect that boundary in person, or try to. Even if we were crawling upon our bellies across the shores of Normandy, say as depicted by Courbet, I still would not tutoyer him unless he gave me express permission to tutoyer him. Even if we were dropping our towels and sprinting into the showers, I would vouvoyer him until he specifically asked me to stop. In fact, I started practicing on the spot. Tell me, Maurice, as a rule, do people call you Maury? Slow and steady wins the race. If it were not so obvious an image, I would like my progress with him to walking. I would liken my progress to him to walking upon the ice covered with a thin layer of fluffy snow. Not that the ice would ever break completely. I mean, there would be no way to rush in with my size 12s. A measured approach would do nicely until he nudged me in the ribs and asked me to call him Maury. Until that moment, I would not let on how much I craved that hint of intimacy, even to admit my size is really 11 and a half. Should I call down our century for its emptiness just because I need that human touch? The tactility of a handwritten letter would form another tiny link between us, thread after thread, and then something would gleam in the morning light. Think of it as a footbridge, our footbridge, named after Maurice Moritz. By the way, I have no aptitude for cursive exercises. Even as a boy, they had to breathe down my neck until the alphabet was finished. Of course, that was part of the charm. I mean, that hot breath upon the nape of my neck and other associations. The assistant will slice into the flap of the envelope and sniff at the contents. Then he will announce the arrival of a handwritten letter. Only a joke at first. Moritz will laugh his disarming laugh and snatch the letter away, overjoyed as not a bomb or toxin from some lunatic. He will unfold it with providential care, and then spare eloquence will wash over him and run down his body like bubble bath. Within the heap of sympathy cards that came in, he would have been lucky to receive one handwritten letter. I just wrote lucky, but that does not seem quite right. It must have come as a shock to discover that his dear Blanche was no longer among the living. He would have amassed a pile of sentiments, the best of brainstorms from some corporate meeting room, hardly the meditation on loss he deserved. I won't bore you with my rough drafts or even with the penultimate prototype. All of them still works in progress. In fact, there are words of comfort that probably won't make it into the fair copy. Maury, if I may call you Maury, I cannot tell you how sorry I am over your loss of that handsome woman. I did not have the good fortune to meet her, but even in the black and white leaflet you had sent around, I could tell she was handsome. Everyone thought so. You'd have to be a proper fool to think otherwise. I want to put crazy there, but the word has fallen out of favor, either because the word is hurtful to those with serious afflictions or because everyone seems a bit off nowadays. A lunatic who would send you a bomb or toxin is another story. I'm not trying to infer that Mrs. Moritz was similarly afflicted. We know what got her in the end. Even if she slept beside her phone or went for smoke breaks every quarter of an hour or hated turmeric, there is still nothing anyone could have done. When your number is up, well, it's up, and that's that. Maury, you will find enclosed a picture of my nuts. I can imagine how that sounds. Only on one occasion did anything like that happen, and then nothing happened. Believe it or not, the picture was by request, and I concealed the goods with a dish towel. Another handsome woman who's no longer on. I might have sent almonds from the get-go, but that would be inaccurate because in the picture you can see the tray of walnuts sitting there like hard little brains. The thing is, I treat them. You see, I'm keen to cultivate the intellect in my stomach. One night I had a sort of revelation. Those flora and fauna were always going to be stunted. In other words, my stomach was always going to be stupid. It did not take me long to track down the culprit. Phytic acid was interfering with my stomach enzymes and holding me back from self-actualization. Fortunately, you can neutralize the phytic acid by soaking the nuts in salt water for 8 hours and then by warming them in the oven. A 2-day process, not that I mind keeping busy. This method also works on my morning oats. Not to badger you, just picture it, 2 men of the world and 2 trays of warm nuts with all the phyte or phytic gone out of them. If you don't find that remotely tempting, then I don't know what. Wait, I forgot about the groats. If you want to soak your oats, you'll need an agent, unlike with nuts. Buckwheat groats do the trick nicely. I mix them in with the oats before I soak them in apple cider vinegar. Stick with me, sir, and you'll never go wanting for iron, calcium, or zinc. Maybe that wouldn't have saved Mrs. Moritz, but who can say for certain? I can only argue in favor of my improved digestion, if not answer for the mental fitness of my stomach or its intelligence quotient. And so I'm going to... Okay, so in Act 3, there's a police clerk named Petra Quest, and she receives a bit of information and a photograph of someone who maybe the actor or the poet, and she's not sure either. And so she recognizes that this is this guy who's on her bus commute. And so though she just isn't really an investigator, she begins to undertake her own kind of quasi-investigation while she's riding the bus. And then anyway, it kind of starts to build, and she gets a little bit obsessed, like a lot of characters in this book. And so I'll read a little bit where something sort of happens after her investigation. The Thursday journey of that week was uneventful. In fact, Petra Quest felt small and ruddy and cold during the entire ride. She had ended up in the rear section of the bus and could neither see nor reach the person of interest. She was seriously considering giving the whole business up, telling herself that it was long past the early giggle or eye roll stage when she still would have been able to turn to Rebecca Feniger for advice. Disembarkation went smoothly enough, with no one standing in her way. She'd walked for about a block before she realized that the footsteps behind her belonged to Q1 or Q2, and so she calls them quotient 1 or quotient 2, the actor or poet. Miss Quest had not been very convincing in this part of her story, perhaps because she could not recall the next 5 to 6 hours in any detail. And she's talking to her supervisors who wonder why she went off in this frolic of her own, this investigation. So this statement brought on the question of whether she had taken or been given a drug that would impair her memory, but in the end, her superiors had concurred that the brain itself was, in the matter of speaking, the most potent manufacturer of drugs. One of her superiors, a certain Mr. Clough, had been sticky on this point, firm in his conviction that it would be practically impossible for a young lady to take a stranger home in this fashion. After all, life was not a Chagall in which you simply floated off with whomever you pleased. Miss Quest had smiled at that point because her memory of that evening was not unlike an abstract painting. She could only piece together how things must have gone. Q1 or Q2 had stood there, and his face and eyes had loomed large. The sensation of sinking into him had been strong, and she felt it would have taken nothing for him to completely enfold her within himself. He had fallen to a step beside her, and that was perfectly natural, as if they'd known each other for many years. She did not think they had said anything, maybe out of fear of breaking the spell. She had brought him to the front of her apartment building and had opened the door with her fob. They had taken the elevator up to the 8th floor, and she had led him to her suite. Once they were inside, she had recovered a little more of her sense of self. Those meager items and keepsakes were the sole property of Petra Quest, and had reminded her that it was her honey trap, not his. Even so, there was not much to say in that happily absurd situation. They had taken off their coats and boots. Then they had sat down on her sofa where they had interacted stiffly, as if they were still in the side saddle 3-seater on the bus. She had introduced herself with a touch of irony, and he had replied, everyone called him Tom. He had noticed her pile of movie discs and had talked softly about them. She could only recall him making a few remarks about Antonioni's Eclipse or Godard's Contempt before she had moved closer and rested her head against his shoulder. He had put his arm around her and raised one of her hands to look at her mauve fingernails with interest. That was when things began to get hazy again. There was some light kissing and quite possibly an exchange of declarations, the sort of clipped speeches that can only be made at dusk. They had stayed like that for a while before moving into her bedroom. Once again, Mr. Clough had taken issue with this sequence of events. How preposterous to take it for granted that 2 working people weary from the 9 to 4 routine would be raring to go at supper time. Miss Quest, a shade flustered, expanded her statement, putting it to her superiors in no uncertain terms that the bedroom does not always necessitate an experience deemed sexual or even carnal. She was not about to call it a thing of appetite, describing an experience surely common to us all, i.e. dinner, doing it, leftover pizza, going back for seconds, water and stray nibbles, switching positions, and so on. She could not reconcile herself with the word spiritual, but it probably had something to do with this man's level of comfort in the domain of something he called the metaphysical erotic. In any case, they had stretched out on the bed in their clothes and had been swallowed up by the growing darkness. Ms. Quest could not remember anything beyond kisses, caresses, and general closeness. Otherwise, the experience had been like being in a trance. Hours later, after they had emerged, she regained possession of herself. He had fished around in his knapsack for a pen and a fat notebook. He had torn off a corner of a page and had written out his phone number beside the name Tom. Mr. Clough had pointed out that such behavior in the era of mobile phones was hardly credible, but Ms. Quest did not dignify his objection with more than a vague murmur. She was able to remember that part distinctly because she'd been thinking how the notebook might clear up and hopefully get rid of those confusing claims made by Dr. Nan, that's a psychiatrist. I'm going to stop there and go on to one more little piece because I'm watching the big clock. Anyway, she finds a notebook, and the notebook begins to suck her into this world of unreality of who this person is. So I'll read a very short bit from the notebook. That's not the notebook itself, but her interpretation of the notebook. Like I'll say that the notebook is full of, I'll call them romantic escapades that are really weird. And so one of them involves sort of a woman that's got a big place, and she has a music student there, and he's kind of got something going on there with and so I'll read a little thing of that short. The following Friday, as if by appointment, he's called Elman in the book, so he has another that echo L. The following Friday, as if by appointment, Elman beat on the gargoyle door knocker. He spoke nervously about Richard Wagner's transitions via his elaborate motivic system from the primeval undulations of Das Rheingold to the anxious, distorted horns of Guder Damaran. He also touched upon the subject of the seafarer who had been cursed, sentenced to an extended life of journeying from shore to shore in the hope of finding a woman's love that would redeem him. Remarkably, Senta has waited all her life for the Flying Dutchman to arrive based on a mystifying picture of him in her family home. Past the halfway point of the opera, the Dutchman appears before Senta, and a duet about the startling revelation ensues. Elman plays special emphasis on his favorite part. Sprich dieses Mädchen viel zu mir, wiegt getreu sein Angelärigkeiten, und meinen Augen seh ich still. Wo sendst du kleine Blicke aus tiefer Nacht empor zu meinem Weib? Ein Schlagen herzlich sagt mir Satans Tüke, das an mir denkt, ich meine Weib. Once again, Yvonne B. admired the ease with which Elman broke through the stillness of the parlor, softly at first, with his sense of pathos and urgency building as he moved towards her chair. Midway through his impromptu aria, she had to stifle a laugh, mainly because of a highly inappropriate impulse that had come over her. Instead, she reached for his hands and closed her eyes, concentrated on the gutturals flowing over her. When he was finished, she stood up and embraced him. His neck locked into place with hers for a long time. Then, without a word, they made their way upstairs. Thank you.
To go. Wow, I actually don't know anyone else who does a reading quite like Garry Thomas Morse. So shall we just like in amazement one more? Most is if you would read me the whole book.
Like the dog and Family Guy. That didn't work out.
That's right. We can redo it. I would say to start, as a reader, the reading you just gave us kind of illuminates my sense of having been a reader wandering through this book, which is, it's just packed. Every sentence is just packed. And it's witty, as you could hear lots of giggling happening because it's full of surprises and full of very rich, intriguing language. It's just amazing, page after page. And I was almost always lost, and I kind of like that, appreciate that. And I thought I would kind of get in the feel of where I was, and then it was, oh boy, okay, what I thought was not kind of it. There was deviations all over the place, digressions, which the voices, and I don't even know who's talking sometimes, and I love that. And I really appreciate that you kept kind of taking the ground out from underneath me as a reader, which I presume, I hope, was part of your point, and not just that I'm like really a very stupid reader. But I wondered if you would actually talk a little bit about, like, how did you go about making any one of those? You could talk about the tiniest bit of narrative. What was your process to keep kind of eroding and eroding and eroding the ground that I felt like I was treading, and I sometimes felt like you were as well as the person writing?
Well, I'm thinking about, I'll come to what you're saying. I'm thinking about a certain poet in the city who was saying about, like, he kind of disparaged the novel a little, as if the language is just kind of not quite as concentrated as poetry. And as a poet coming to the novel form, which is always a bit of a joke, I know. But I think my thing is always to pack the language with as much as possible, and it can make for my novels are often described as difficult, but I think it's really important to have everything be really jam-packed with that kind of value, almost like it's value added. And I think in terms of the digressions, and I like I'm forgetting his name, but I'm liking this kind of these nested kind of stories within stories. Like, that's become really I should add that this is kind of the technique of, I'm not that familiar with, there's only so much that's been translated, but in my mother's people, the Kwakwaka'wakw, actually have a kind of style like this, where there's so many diversions and digressions, and I'd say also in the Irish novelists I really admire a lot of this, like Flann O'Brien did At Swim Two Birds has this kind of thing where he keeps having stories within stories. And also, I like digressions. I know the thing today is to have this certain style of immediacy. And so when I pick up a book, I kind of go, okay, here's this dude, she wakes with a sweat. And I like this. I like digressions. I actually kind of, if I know what's going to happen, say by the end of a book, I actually would like to delay it in many different ways, because I think that's part of the journey. So that's really important to me, and not just go, here's what has to happen. These things have to happen by this time. Because I know some people think that way or work that way. And then a novel form.
So on that topic, I think I want to sort of go in two different directions. And one is the playfulness around genre and sort of what I might expect when I'm reading a novel, or various kinds of genre fiction structures keep playing their way through here too, which kind of generates certain expectations, which are then kind of dashed over and over again. So I would love to talk a little bit about that, but I also would like to talk a little bit about how you make character, because I think that it seems to me this is a very deeply philosophical novel, which really has to do with kind of perspective, point of view, knowledge, reality, unreality, and do you get toward a clearer sense of reality by not speaking, by speaking evasively or by nesting. So I sort of feel like those two things might be related somehow, kind of how you use the conventions of fiction, but also how you use the conventions of making character or establishing point of view and qualities of character, because there's some very colorful characters in here, but I never really am quite sure that I know who they are, because they always surprise me as well.
I think, well, I think in a lot of my books, I like layering as well. That's something I enjoy. And so I think that you, like the narrative layer, yeah, this is something we actually see a lot of this more in movies, but maybe not so much in contemporary fiction. And so it's like, who is the narrator? Even I'm not obvious. Like the third part I thought might have been written by this student who's just doing their creative thesis on the double in literature, which is of course of interest to me. But the perspective shift to this police clerk, who this young woman is kind of interesting because it's, to me, it's kind of exciting. It's a change. And then within the middle of that, she has a coworker, or there's somebody with the police who would like to write a crime series or some kind of speculative series. And so she interprets her dream, and then there's all this strange, there's some things go way into the past, like a Jane Austen type thing, and then another thing will go into the future where there's some kind of totally like sci-fi or speculative series. So that I like those digressions. I think they add to it rather than take away from having just one track, one narrative thing. So I hope the reader enjoys. That's the model.
They definitely do. I think they definitely do have, add something really important. And I just wonder if you'd say a little bit more about that. Like what
well, I'd like to answer let's say a little more on what you're asking, because I think philosophically this book was a lot about the state of unreality we live in, so that we kind of where we don't know what's real anymore. We don't know what is real through the media, through the internet. We tend to be in this narrow focus, and so there's all the layers are there. And so I just wanted to bring this to the book form and as much as possible, maybe. So there's all kinds of movement and shifting, and so I think it is about unreality, because you have many different versions of the same story. Like there's a story about a car accident that happened, and this is like maybe some nefarious thing happened, and there's some people involved, and these characters are kind of it's kind of retold over and over again in different forms. Even that guy you heard from that's obsessed with Maurice Moritz, he begins to tell a different version of that. And so you're wondering, is this building? It's kind of like trying to build a DIY detective story. And so there's kind of a lot of play with that. It got me out of a rut. I was in a rut with this because I wrote one thing and I wasn't satisfied with it. And I thought, oh, let's just keep regenerating it and reinvigorating it until it became its own. So there's a little bit of a form, and that's a pretty dull thing to say. Someone on the internet was just like, oh, here we go forward again. Some poet.
Okay,
but
so
it's beautiful. Language is beautiful. Like we spend a lot of time. Like there's some wonderful people here, some wonderful people from Hens. We spend all our time working on language, and so I think that it is interesting. If you spend so much time with it, you love it in some way. So I think it's a homage to language. Sorry, go ahead. More.
Okay, I actually just want to drill down a little bit on that, because I think you were offering me something about process. So you were working on a thing and felt like it was kind of stalling out on you, and then you kind of.
Yeah, so I was working on something I'll say that it's a French novelist, and my issues always when I'm being too imitative. I kind of either abandon something or leave it, and so it has to somehow be fresh for me when I'm working on it. So I had this thing that was like, I was like, oh, I'll just write a detective story that's this long, and I just started that way, and then I wasn't really. It kind of was shorter than that, and I wasn't quite. So, but I kept that piece because I really loved it. But I kept on with different versions of it, like all the elements. Here's a character that might be. And it sort of began to form by itself. Like I know writers like Alice Munro and Javier Marias, they say that they don't know how their novel is going to end or their story is going to end, and so they just carry on. I believe in that method. And to get back to you, we were talking about her wonderful sourdough baking. Like William Burroughs talked about the fold-in method, so that's one of my favorite. That's kind of as a way of describing where you're working on something. You go, oh, I'll just throw in. And I do tend to do that. I know maybe it's annoying, but I like that. I like adding something that's completely incongruous. Like, let's throw rid of this and that, and it still reinforms the process about how the characters are interacting.
One thing I really enjoyed about that folding in was, I think, oh, there's Garry throwing something in, but then it's in the next moment I think, oh wait, is that Garry folding something in, or is that the character that Garry built?
I don't know.
Wow, so you don't know either.
I don't always know. sometimes have an idea, but that's enjoyable too. Not knowing is really enjoyable. I know there was an author recently, I won't say who, but in town that was somebody, there's a critique, a little stupid critique about how, oh, this is too ambiguous or doesn't have a proper, like, and it's like you can leave stuff ambiguous, or we don't always know how the stories can end up. That's kind of like life, like we don't always know. But part of the thing is near the end of it, there's this publication called the Prairie Pulse, and they kind of recontextualize everything because they have a sort of tabloid version of everything. So you actually get some facts in there. How, it's kind of.
Do we trust it?
Yeah, do we trust it? Do we trust the Prairie Pulse?
I don't know. I don't know if I trust that Prairie Pulse.
It's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to write those. It was like a series of articles.
So that brings me back again to that idea about sort of folding different genres together.
Mm-hmm.
And you just said about when something gets too imitative, you start to feel uncomfortable with it. And is that related for you with this idea of doubling and the doppelgangers and the mirrors and the sort of might be the stunt doubles and all that? It seems like that's also about versions.
Well, I think this kind of ties into what you were asking me before, because the unreality, I was interested in the anxiety of today that this sort of unreality we live in brings. And so the anxiety would be, because I've experienced this as some kind of creative, that you create something and then it seems to have all this impact out there. It's like a golem that's kind of running amok, and people react to things you don't understand. People see themselves in books and all kinds of weird stuff. I won't even go through all the stories, but I did some of that at the University of Winnipeg distinguished talk. I did, but I gave a little more in the dirt. But there's like these situations that really inspire this process where you imagine that these versions of yourself are out there in all these places doing all these things when you're just sitting at home making sourdough bread. So it's really fascinating, but that's the level of unreality we're at. There's all kinds of stuff that doesn't seem a fact anymore. So the idea of having psychical or creative doubles or projections of your mind or creativity seems to be, I'm like, yeah, I'll go with that. Let's have as many as possible out there doing all kinds of things. So that's kind of what's in the book.
So do you feel that the sort of the feeling or the mood in the book is itself anxious, or does it not feel like that to you?
I wouldn't say so, because I tend to be like, even if there's miserable situations in my life, I tend to see them as kind of funny, like there's a weird objectivity there. Like I can step back and go, this is kind of thing. So that tends to be my mode, is to try to find some humor, and not even if I feel sincerely, it's wonderful. It's kind of folding in the cynicism with the levity, and it just.
Sourdough.
That's how sourdough tastes.
It's bread.
It's a little bit of accurate
stink.
So yeah, so it's a way of combining that, so it's sort of palatable. Like I was reading something like Jim Thompson, and he had a whole thing about making bread, and I think they have some kind of like plaster with a tiny bit of something to put it in. It's really bizarre, but it seems to help keep the structure of the bread. He's worried about it. He said, why are you putting plaster in there? Lisa's laughing with us, so let's make some sculpture. But yeah, it's interesting what you learn in books.
It is interesting. It's interesting what you can learn in this book. Do we believe is there like factual base to most of like the really esoteric weird stuff in here? Where did you make up some of that?
I don't think so. Like one thing that happened to me, I'll say, instead of I'll dodge your question, but I'll say that like during the pandemic, what happened was I happened to be going from a workplace on the bus. And so there were all these people, like these kind of characters. And so it was so familiar to me every day that it began to become this living tableau of like a parlor or something. But then the pandemic restrictions came and they all disappeared. I was like, where have all the people gone? I need sketches of life. And so that was an interesting point, because I had to make this jumping off point into completely imaginative space with all those people being gone. And that was, at first it seemed really scary, and then it seemed like it was working. So it got more and more surrealistic involving this character of Petra Quest, where she begins to see almost like hallucinations and stuff because she's stressed out by the pandemic conditions.
This is kind of a pandemic book?
The third part is more, the other stuff was written earlier. So I'm going to say, I don't want to say some of it. The other part is more just stories.
So will you talk a little bit about, like you actually talked about them as 3 acts, because I've been sort of thinking about like the structuring thing, and we do sort of hop from place to place, and well, we hop a lot from place to place, but if you talk a little bit about that large structure.
Well, the first part is it's just I call it the story of Gellhorn and Aaron Schnell, the double. So that's mainly focused on that. There's a little bit about academic life, which comes from that's so it's a little bit of this, a little bit inspired by a place where I was doing a residency, but they had all these ritualistic things and going to tables. So it's just like describing all that stuff is kind of, I don't know, it's fun. I find it fun. But so then that part turns out to be a fragment that was written by this author named Thomas Clack. So he's the guy who's departed. So the chair goes on a strange journey of returning to the real places, and he's trying to relive almost. Like after he goes through all these little stories, he tries to go back, and he's wishing this fragment had really turned into a full novel. And so he has this strange, he's almost like becomes a double of that character, that person. And then the third part is this Petra quest I talked about quite a bit. And so she goes off, and you don't really know if that story is a police report or it's written by a thesis student in one of the other parts, and it's her perspective. And so, like I said, it's all kind of shifting.
Most definitely.
I can't say for sure.
You because you don't know, or because you won't tell?
I can't. I don't think I know exactly. I have suspicions.
we can grill you about it later. Even the pieces that you read tonight, one of the things that I sense in them, that I sense in all the characters, is this sort of somewhere between obsession and seduction. There's a lot of that sort of, so to be very compelled by a story, by a character, by something that is hard to understand or hard to grasp.
Well, I agree with you, but what I'd say to that is it's also the reaction of things. Like at one point, there's these nude paintings of one of those characters, the man, and so the police clerk sees these, and so it's kind of her reaction to it, because she does have a bit of an art credit, or a few art credits in her background, and she begins to see all kinds of things like by Seurat and these painters and like pointillist. So the reality begins to turn into an abstract painting. So even like that bit I read where she's thinking about abstract paintings, and so her reality. So it's more her reaction to that presentation, which I think is interesting today, because there's a bit of maybe also there's a reactionary thing to art, to ideas, to words, and so we should get rid of all of it because it's so dangerous. And that's a little bit of the element in the book. Like everything's really dangerous to the people. So I like the chair. Basically, they're both figures, I think, kind of authority figures that lose their way as they get sucked into the world of art, which is kind of my gotcha. So see, the honey trap, that kind of is almost could serve as an illusion to that. They're being pulled into the big honey trap of art and literature. It's fun.
And how there's a lot of art references. I mean, art, painting, music, books, and in a way, it feels like the characters who are, either real or fictional in this novel are also kind of going to those places to be like, to feel like they're getting to the point of something, but also to realize that the thing that they're looking at that has the most kind of credibility for them is itself, kind of created, made, artifice at some.
Yeah, that's artifice is material, and that's like I remember the story of Zeuxis and Parrhasius is one of my favorite ones. Zeuxis, he painted the grapes, and the birds would come down to eat them, and there's a painting, and so then he goes to look at Parrhasius's work, and when he goes to look to pull back the curtain is the painting. He's like, oh damn, or whatever he said in ancient Greek. But it's like, so that's like, yeah. And so that's a little bit, oh, actually Shakespeare, I think a lot about Shakespeare. I'm actually working on something with it. I call it R.D. Noir because it mixes some Shakespeare comedies and the detective genre. But Shakespeare always, one of my favorite things about him is he always has this playing with levels, and that's the biggest inspiration of that, where he's always trying to plays within plays and things where there is another, and it's all done through language, which is always the extraordinary things. So I'm glad if I'm having a little bit of that effect on you, that's good.
It's remarkable.
Mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. I think we should open the floor for questions from, what do you think?
The interweb.
The
Now I've offended the interweb. Unreality.
Are there questions for this brilliant man?
Garry, it's amazing. You cram so much into the novel. What do you cut out? Is there anything you cut out?
Yes, actually, there was an opera sequence that I thought it was too long in the middle part, and I removed it and I put it somewhere else. Maybe it's going to be a stumbling block in another project, but it was a little bit about. A little bit inspired by this with an amateur opera group in Vancouver, so I had a little bit inspired by some of my experiences with that and putting on all these different Verdi operas and the G.D. Lammermoor and also all the stuff. And so it was kind of an interesting. So it just felt like it made the middle part even longer, and so I actually made I was like, okay, my darling, I don't want to do this, but it was quite dramatic actually.
Sort of operatic.
Yeah, and there's plenty of other stuff in there. So, yeah. So I did cut something. Isn't like the beauty is already in the stone, and you have to release it. So that's how it's looking.
That's a very large stone to start with.
Yeah, very. And more of.
Sorry. I believe it was Mark Twain who said that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. It's something to the effect of that. And it's very evident to me that you find the right word for every situation. How do you do that?
I try. All I'll say is that I appreciate your compliment. I think it's more with the poetic sensibilities that you spend so much time going by fragments or lines or smaller units of language that you don't really want to have that feeling of what I call like filler, or and so I have flaws obviously, but I try to keep it as concentrated as possible. So I appreciate your compliment. I try for that. I try for the mot juste, the right word when possible. But there's I know there is a right word. I think there's all kinds of words, but I probably am attracted to the sound of language as much as anything else, and that leads me. It leads me rather than me trying to think my way to lead the language. I think that's the better way of putting it. So I listen for language rather than me trying to direct it.
And we do have time for one more question, if anyone has one out there.
Sarah, one of the Sarahs.
One of the Sarahs. Now I will speak for all of the Sarahs.
This is my mentor, by the way.
Oh my God.
She taught me everything I know.
I guess my general question is like, what motivates you to share your stories with, like, I don't know, people? Like, I don't know. I feel like it's like it's such a vulnerable feeling to share like your soul and art with other people. So I kind of feel like art is like a vector of the soul. So.
Well, that's really lovely. Yes, I think especially, I think the pandemic brought home for me this, I was both working at home and then writing, and it made it more poignant maybe to be able to, even like this, to share with a group of humans. And it doesn't feel the same to me of doing stuff online. Like I had a book that came out and I did stuff online, and I just don't get the same feeling out of it. I mean, I used to like where we have this these meetings downtown at the library, and everybody would come and be physically present and read their poetry or writing. And they do it online at the moment, I believe, and I just don't feel like, even though I know it's great, but I can't interact with it the same way through a screen. And so I really liked your presences, and later I'll go away and fantasize, but no, it's no, I don't want to turn it that way. I think, no, I appreciate just sharing with you all. It makes me feel better. It's my goal in life is to turn this stuff going on in here to externalize it and try to express it in the best way I possibly can, which is impossible, but still I endeavor to do that, and that's part of probably being a writer or being a poet or whatever I am. So, thanks, Sarah.
John, are you gonna come back out from your little cubby?
I was wondering if either of you had any dramatic closing words, but that is also a wonderful note to end on.
It's a wonderful note to end on.
Perfect. So we will be moving along to the signing portion of the evening. So if you'll just remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Garry to a table just beside our cash desk.
Take it back.
Blindfolded.
The litter will emerge in a moment. Tulpa Mea Culpa is the book. We have many copies of it behind our cash desk on the signing table, so please do avail yourself of one. You can get it signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book. Otherwise, thank you all so very much for joining us here tonight. Thank you to Garry and Charlene for the reading and the incredibly incisive conversation, and to all of you for your comments and your questions. The book again is Tulpa Mea Culpa, published by the good folks at At Bay Press. Please join me one more time in acknowledging Garry Thomas Morse.